Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's recital on the world's greatest jazz band, or to give it its full name, the world's greatest jazz band of Yank Lawson and Bob Haggart, which was an all-star jazz ensemble active across 10 years from 1968 to 1978. The group was founded by jazz fan and promoter Dick Gibson during one of his annual jazz parties. The band was co-led throughout its existence by Yank Lawson, American jazz trumpeter known for Dixieland and swing music, and for his time with Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, and most notably the Bob Crosby Orchestra. And Bob Haggart, double bass player, composer, and arranger, also with the Bob Crosby Orchestra, and known as one of the finest rhythm bassists of the swing era. The name World's Greatest Jazz Band sounds somewhat pretentious, but over the years, the band featured a veritable who's who of Dixieland, swing, and mainstream jazz musicians, wholly justifying the name. You could argue even making it obligatory. The group recorded early jazz standards alongside contemporary pop songs, arranged and performed in a Dixieland style, like this one, which begins with Yank Lawson's muted trumpet. Yeah. So it must be him. That was the song. That was from the band's second LP called Extra, recorded in 1969. Now, the song It Must Be Him was written by French composer Gilbert Bécaud with English lyrics by Mac David and was associated with pop singer Vicky Carr and reached number 2 in the UK charts in 1967. Now, apart from Yank Lawson's muted trumpet, we also heard the open trumpet of Billy Butterfield. We heard Bob Wilber on clarinet and Carl Fontana on trombone. Now, the next track is from their very first album, the title of which clearly sets out the stall for the band itself. The LP was called The World's Greatest Jazz Band of Yank Lawson and Bob Haggart, and it was recorded in 1969. Now, this song was published in 1912 and is sometimes known as Panama Rag. You'll hear solos from Bud Freeman on tenor and again Bob Wilber on clarinet, and it's called Panama. Yeah. So that was Panama. And also from that first album is a tune co-written by Bob Haggart and first recorded back in 1938 when he was with Bob Crosby's Bobcats. Haggart provides the whistling and the bass playing. Maury Felt is on drums and at one point uses his sticks to drum on the strings of the double bass. The tune is, of course, Big Noise from Winnetka. Yeah, some serious drumming from Maury Felt there. Um, okay, so we've heard a few tracks from that early couple of albums, but let's now take a look at the band in action from around that time. Here they are on the Ed Sullivan TV show from the 4th of January, 1970, with Savoy Blues. Yeah, well, they were certainly enjoying themselves there. So let me just put that back on the screen. Yeah, that was from January 1970 on the Ed Sullivan TV show. What about that double trombone lineup of Kai Winding and Carl Fontana as well? That was something to see and hear. So we saw Billy Butterfield there as well. So let's put the spotlight on him for a minute. Taken from the band's second album, again, the one called Extra. Here we have the pure singing sound of Billy Butterfield's open trumpet on this Burt Bacharach Hal David tune. But listen up also for a very smooth soprano sax solo from Bob Wilber. Well, Sid asking for our upcoming members' choice for performers and songs that deserve a little bit more love and attention. So, how about Billy Butterfield in that category? In fact, so the band's final album of 1970 was Live at the Roosevelt Grill, and Come Back Sweet Papa was written by Louis Russell and Paul Barberin and was given its first outing by Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five back in 1926. 10 years later, it was recorded by the Bob Crosby Orchestra, so we can easily understand why it would have made its way into the world's greatest jazz band's repertoire. This is Come Back Sweet Papa. Yeah, and from that same live album from 1971, a song written by Joseph Meyer and Herman Ruby, My Honey's Loving Arms. It was first recorded in 1922 by the Virginians, in 1932 by the original Memphis Five, and in 1933 by Bing Crosby and the Mills Brothers. The band in this live performance includes Gus Johnson on drums, Lou McGarity, and Vic Dickinson on the duo trombones. My Honey's Loving Arms. Yeah, great performance there from 1971. Also in 1971, there was another album called What's New. And this has a nice mix of Dixieland, modern jazz, and some ballads. And here's the title track, written by Bob Haggart, lyrics by Johnny Burke, and the featured soloist is again Billy Butterfield. Yeah, super stuff there from the album What's New. I mentioned that there was a modern jazz element to this album as well. And here's the band's version of the Joe Zawinul classic, Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. That should get you out of bed in the mornings, huh? And again, it's one of those tracks that you think, could go on for another hour and a half. No problem. It's a great album, What's New, and it really does show the versatility of the band. So we're going to look at a bluesy band sound now from the 1972 album called Century Plaza. This track is a showcase for some fine solo playing from just about everyone in the lineup, namely Bob Wilber on soprano sax, Bud Freeman on tenor, Vic Dickinson on trombone again, Yank Lawson's muted trumpet, and Ralph Sutton on piano. And this is Heavy Hearted Blues. Yeah, a real nice bluesy sounds there on heavy-hearted blues and some great solo work as well. Now, from the same album, there's the more trad sounding Walter Donaldson composition at Sundown, and this includes a lot of heavy work from Mr. Haggart on bass, but also a real nice walking bass solo from him. Yeah. And from that same 1972 album, the song Dreaming Butterfly was written by Bob Wilber, and it truly showcases his own very romantic soprano playing. Yeah, Bob Wilbur's own composition there, uh, Dreaming Butterfly. So we'll end the first half with another of those 1960s pop tunes from the album Extra. Here, the band really swings and strolls through this Paul Simon tune. End of pun. Okay, welcome back to part two. So, on the 15th of December 1971, the world's greatest jazz band appeared in no less a place than the Manchester Free Trade Hall. And here's Yank Lawson introducing the band members.
Thank you. I'm Yank Lawson, and that's my partner, Bob Haggart. I'd like to introduce you to the rest of the members of our group. First of all, Gus Johnson, Jr. on the drums. And Ralph Sutton at the piano. Bob Wilbur, clarinet and soprano saxophone. Vic Dickinson, trombone. Bud Freeman, saxophone. And on the other trombone, Ed Hubble. I knew there was somebody else. Billy Butterfield.
Yeah, so that just a free trade hall. December 15th, 1971. And from that night in Manchester, here's Ain't Misbehaving, of course, the Andy Razaf and Fats Waller tune. Yeah. Bud Freeman and Bob Wilbur really going to town there. So from the same concert, same night, another Fats Waller tune, Black and Blue. And finally, then, from what sounded like a great night in Manchester, December 15th, 1971, we finish on a really rousing South Rampton Street parade. Incidentally, this was co-written by Bob Haggart, of course. Yeah, well, I know that had folks rocking back in the Manchester Free Trade Hall in 1971. Okay, so in keeping with the era of the songbook albums of the 1950s and 60s, the world's greatest jazz band embarked on their own tribute to the composers of the Great American Songbook. Like Ella Fitzgerald some years before, they opened the book with the songs of the composer whom Sammy Cahn called both Gilbert and Sullivan. That's Cole Porter. And this is from 1975. And with a few new faces, Peanuts Hucko on clarinet, John Best trumpet, Tommy Newsom on tenor, and George Masso on trombone. Yeah, the great Cole Porter jazz standard, if you like, It's All Right With Me. 1976, and the world's greatest jazz band plays Duke Ellington, opens with the Duke's signature tune, which the Duke had made his own, but was written by Billy Strayhorn. Billy Butterfield is back in favour on the trumpet, but there are others new personnel include Phil Bodner on clarinet, Al Klink on sax, George Masso and Sonny Rosso on the trombones. world's greatest jazz band putting their own stamp on Take the A Train, of course. Let me just share it. Okay, same year, 1976, the band followed up with the world's greatest jazz band plays Rodgers and Hart. The tune Have You Met Miss Jones is presented a little slower than usual. George Masso opens on the two trombone exchange, followed by Carl Fontana. Johnny Best plays the open horn statement that follows Peanuts Hucko's clarinet. Yeah, great Roger and Hart tune there. So inevitably, and what turned out to be their final songbook album was a tribute to George Gershwin. So it's now 1977, and the lineup has only changed slightly from the halcyon days of the band. Haggart and Lawson, of course, are still there. Peanuts Hucko on clarinet, Masso and Fontana on the two exchange trombones, Billy Butterfield back on trumpet, but now with Nick Fatul on drums, Roger Kellaway on piano, and Eddie Miller on sax. And this is Swonderful. Yeah, no, after that, we'll slow the pace down for a track with a beautiful and ultra romantic song of Gershwin's I've Got a Crush on You. Yeah, proving you can't beat a Gershwin tune. So before that, back in 1976, just a year before, in fact, the band cut an album of country-themed songs, and it was titled Way Out West. Now, this is with a smaller than usual group consisting of Bill Stegmeyer on clarinet, Cliff Lehman on drums, Lou Stein on piano, and Bud Freeman back on tenor. And here's Hoagie Carmichael's Old Buttermilk Sky. Yeah, Whole Bottom Sky. Now, the tracks on this particular album, Way Out West, I'm not sure why, but they're all very short in length, with not one of them reaching the 3 minute mark. Well, this one has Bob Haggart whistling again, as we heard much earlier on the Big Noise from Winnetka track. And Sid, I think you knew this was coming. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. So the band was out on tour again in 1977, and in a rare turn of events, they engaged the vocalist, swing era singer Maxine Sullivan, to perform with them. So let's hear a couple of tracks from that outing.
Great pleasure for me to bring up a wonderful singer and a wonderful person, Maxine Sullivan. Maxine Sullivan.
When skies are cloudy and gray, they're only gray for a day. Wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Until that sunshine peeps through, there's only one thing to do. Wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Your castles may crumble, it's fate after all. Life's funny that way. No use to grumble, smile as they fall. Weren't you king for a day, say? Just remember that the sunshine always follows the rain. Wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Skies are cloudy and gray, they're only gray for a day. Wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Until that sunshine and dream your troubles away. Your castles may crumble, it's fate after all. Life's funny that way. No use to grumble, smile as they fall. Weren't you king for a day, say? Just remember that the sunshine always follows the rain. Wrap your troubles in dreams and dream your troubles away. Dream your troubles away. It was just one of those things, just one of those crazy things, one of those bells that now and then rings, just one of those things. It was just one of those nights, just one of those crazy flights, a trip to the moon on gossamer wings. Just one of those things. If we thought of it, of the end of it, when we started painting the town, we'd have been aware that our love affair was too hot not to cool down. So farewell and amen. Here's hoping we meet now and then. It was great fun, but it was just one of those things. It was just one of those things, just one of those crazy things, one of those bells that now and then ring. Just one of those things. It was just one of those nights, just one of those crazy flights, a trip to the moon on gossamer wings. Just one of those things. If we thought of it, of the end of it, when we started painting the town, we'd have been aware that our love affair was too hot not to cool down. So farewell and amen. Here's hoping we meet now and then. It was great fun, but it was just one of those, just one of those, just one of those things,
Maxine Sullivan, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, 1977 there with Maxine Sullivan. Well, the group disbanded in 1978, but the name was revived now and again by Lawson and Haggart for a few limited engagements, although not with the original band members, of course. So to play us out, we'll see a latter-day lineup, still fronted by Lawson and Haggart, at the Bern Jazz Festival in 1991. Other members are Randy Sanker on trumpet, George Masso, still there on trombone, Roy Williams, trombone, Kenny DeVerne on clarinet, Christian Plattner on tenor, Brian Lemon on piano, Bucky Pizzarelli on guitar, and Jake Hanna on drums. So they still have a good stake for the moniker of the world's greatest jazz band. Just to let you know, I've joined two videos together here. So the reason is that the video of the ensemble playing is quite high quality, but it doesn't have the band coming onto the stage and being introduced. So I've added that on, but it's not such a good quality video, but I think you'll enjoy it anyway. And the guys are playing Sometimes I'm Happy. Oops.
Jahre. Ich darf den Musiker vorstellen, am Schlagzeug Mr. Jake Hanna, Guitarra, Mr. Bucky Pizzarelli. Brian Lemon on piano. He's from England. Then aus Österreich, Christian Plattner, Tenorsaxophon. Kenny DeVone, Klarinette. Randy Sanke, Trompete. George Masso, Posaune. Roy Williams, Posaune. Roy Williams, flute. Then die beiden co-leaders on bass, Mr. Bob Haggart. And on trumpet, 80 years old yesterday, Mr. Yank Lawson. You guys are okay.
Yeah, we heard Yank Lawson there say, "You guys are okay." Something of an understatement, I'd say. Anyway, and so we bring the curtain down on the world's greatest jazz band, and I hope you enjoyed the music.
Yeah.